Hi, everybody. This is Ann Patchett at Parnassus Books. Thank you for listening to Parnassus Presents. Your support allows us to keep bringing you fantastic events. So please consider purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book at the link below. We hope you enjoy the event, recorded live from the Parnassus stage.
Welcome. I'm Elise Adler, and I am the Director of Events for Parnassus Books. So I get to say thank you for being here. Welcome to Montgomery Bell Academy, and we appreciate you. And Erik Larson is in the house, and we couldn't be more thrilled. So this evening is very special. It's a partnership between Parnassus Books, Humanities Tennessee, and Montgomery Bell Academy, and it never ceases to be appreciated by me that we live in a city where so many wonderful educational organizations, they work so well together. And these have been long-standing partners for forever, really, and we're so appreciative. So I want to say thank you to William Daughtry, head of schools, and to Langan Coleman, who always makes everything happen, and the AV folks in security and facilities to make this beautiful theater possible for all of us to be here tonight. And then to Humanities Tennessee, who are so wonderful, to Tim Henderson and Serenity Gerbman, and to Lacey Lindsay, and there's probably about a dozen folks that, as we speak, are working their tails off at Bicentennial Mall, getting ready for Southern Festival of Books. You want to applaud them? Go ahead, they deserve it. So I know I'm going to see you all there. So download the app. There's this great app for Southern Festival, and don't miss anything. It's all going to be fabulous. So why we're here? Okay, Erik Larson. He is an award-winning, national best-selling author of 6 previous bestsellers: The Splendid and the Vile, Dead Wake, In the Garden of Beasts, Thunderstruck, The Devil in the White City, and Isaac's Storm. I've read them all, and they are fabulous, as I'm sure you have too. They have collectively sold more than 12 million copies, and his books have been published in nearly 40 countries. And tonight, Erik is in conversation with Jeremy Finley, a chief investigative reporter who has won several of journalism's highest honors. As a novelist, his books have been featured in People magazine, the New York Post, and on NPR. And you all also might know him as the co-host of Word on Words on National Public Television, which features authors and their latest books. So help me welcome Erik Larson and Jeremy Finley.
Let's see.
Hello.
It's red, but I think red means good. We need to make a correction right off the bat. It's 7, right?
7.
7 bestsellers.
Right.
I also want to let you guys...
He is an investigative reporter.
That's right. I am.
Absolutely
it's facts
accurate
matter.
tonight.
Facts matter. I want to let you know what happened before we got up here. I walked back to meet Erik, and he was sitting talking with Ann Patchett. And so he and Ann were sitting there talking, and they said, "Would you mind to pull up a seat?" And so I don't know what you guys were doing, but I was talking to Erik Larson and Ann Patchett while you all were in here. 2 of, I think, our greatest writers together. Erik Larson, welcome to Nashville.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is this the first time?
No. I've been here before, and in fact, I was actually very bummed today to learn from someone that Rotier is closed. I had planned to go and have some fried green tomatoes, have that hamburger, and a milkshake.
I know. It is one of our greatest losses, I think, that we're still getting over. But welcome back.
Thank you.
So in thinking about how we would start our conversation tonight, so many books have been written about the Civil War, about Abraham Lincoln, about the folly of the Confederacy. And I wonder what made you think there's a story here that hasn't been told, or is a story that needs to be told and hasn't gotten enough attention.
So you're basically asking me, what was I thinking?
Yeah, what were you thinking?
Yeah. Well, first of all, backstory, and this is absolutely true, and you can Google this, is that if you go back over the last probably 20 years, you will hear me repeatedly saying, I am never going to write a book about the Civil War. and I'm never going to write a book about Abraham Lincoln. And now here I am with a book that is centered on the start of the Civil War, in which Abraham Lincoln is a key character. But I'll tell you how this came about. And yes, it was a little daunting. I asked my good friend Siri, after a couple of drinks, I asked her, how many books have been written about the Civil War? And she said, 60,000. Was that daunting to me? Yes, sure was. But what happened was this. I had been out on a book tour for my previous book, The Splendid and the Vile, about Winston Churchill, when the pandemic intensified, the world locked down, and halfway through my tour, I was on a plane home. So I get home, this is in March of 2020, fly home on my wife's birthday. We go out to our pandemic fortress out on eastern Long Island. I have a lot of time on my hands that I had not planned to have. So I started looking for my next idea. I had 3 or 4 ideas that I was looking into in sort of a dilatory way. Nothing particularly struck me. But if you recall back then, there was a good deal, as there is now, unfortunately, good deal of political discord with a lot of fringe groups like Texas talking. I have a daughter who lives in Austin and loves it. But there were a lot of fringe groups who were talking about secession and contemporary Civil War, And so one of the things that suddenly popped up on my list, I thought, well, how did the Civil War actually start? I didn't know. I had only a yeoman's knowledge of the Civil War. So I started looking into it. Ordinarily, when a question occurs to me that seems to have the potential to become a book, I would jump into a physical archive just to see what kind of materials were there, what texture, letters, telegrams, and so forth. Pandemic, obviously, I could not do that, right? The archives were actually closed, and even if the key archives were open, I would not want to have taken a train or flown to them. So I started doing some online research, which I don't like to do. I find it stultifying. But I came across this very interesting collection of documents called The War of the Rebellion, a compilation of the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. How's that? How's that for a recall? And I started reading this thing. It's got hundreds of documents in scrupulously curated chronological order. A telegram response, letter response, report response, and so forth. And I read enough of this to realize this thing is really riveting. It really captures a sense of this descent towards civil war in that period. So I managed to find a bound volume. There's the whole set of those records. There are bound volumes. So I ordered volume 1 from whatever source had these volumes. Of course, it arrived at my pandemic fortress, and I did, in fact, disinfect it. Remember those days? The spraying the packages when they come. And so did that. Started reading this thing again, and as I got through the whole volume, I really realized that this is the story. This is like as a writer. I mean, this is the suspense spine that I'm always looking for before I actually get started on a research project. And this was the story. What's more riveting than this descent toward America's greatest tragedy?
And I'm glad that you said that you didn't know at the beginning how the Civil War truly started, and because I don't feel as dumb now that I also did not know until I read this book the specifics of.
Yeah, but I was joking. See, now you're out.
So my intelligence has been solidified here. But I will ask you something that you have described this time period before the attack on Fort Sumter as a political horror story.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, political horror story, political thriller. I mean, it has all the elements of a work of fiction that would be a scary thing. Like if you're writing about, I don't know, like the old novel 7 Days in May. Absolutely riveting about a coup, a thwarted coup in the United States. Dates back to when was that? 70s, yep. Whatever. So political horror story, it transcended simple history. I saw the potential for this to be so riveting, so catch people up so much in the TikTok, journalistic term, not the other term, catch people up in the TikTok to the point where they would suspend their knowledge of what happened and maybe sink into the past and get caught up in this inexorable march toward the war. But an interesting thing happened while I was working on this thing. I was 10 months in to the preliminary work, reading these online documents, finding other online troves of documents, when January 6th occurred. So 10 months I've been working on this. January 6th, the events of that day occur. I watched this whole thing unfold in my office, and I was riveted, I was furious, I was scared. You went through this whole gamut of emotions, as those tourists charged through the Capitol. Sorry. So I felt this. I felt this. Like, wow, this is what I'm feeling. This is what people certainly must have felt back in the day. And suddenly I realized this is not some hoary story from the past. This is a story that I'm trying to tell that has a real contemporary resonance. Now, if you read the book, you will know that there is zero reference in the book to Trump. There's zero reference in the book to January 6th, except in my opening paragraph of my author's note, where I mentioned that was what really sort of, got me completely committed to this idea. In retrospect, may I say something? I feel, in the end, I should not have had that in that opening paragraph. Really? And I came to that conclusion only about a month ago when I got this really wise direct message via Twitter. I know it's an oxymoron, but it's true. This guy, this very smart guy, sent me, said, love the book, blah, blah, blah. And he said, but when you open with January 6th, it suddenly you take us out of the bubble. Take us out of the historical bubble that I'm trying to create. And so I was thinking about that. I thought, that's true. I mean, people would make the parallels anyway.
Sure.
I'm not sure I had to actually mention it, but at the time, of course, I wasn't thinking straight.
In my work as a journalist, I had the unfortunate job of scrolling through hours and hours of the attack on January 6th. So I have watched minute by minute videos of this. And so when people say to me, it was not an attack, it was a day at the park, you describe whatever you want to. It did make me think about how history can be whitewashed in so many ways. And in part of what you do for us is you kind of rip off the Band-Aid and you say, this is how ugly it was. And which leads me to this question, speaking of horror, because there's a quote from James Hammond in the book when he writes about the children that he and his son Harry had sired with slaves, including the slave Louisa. And that quote is, "Do not let Louisa or any of my children or possible children be slaves of strangers. Slavery in the family will be their happiest earthly condition." And that mindset that slaves were better off in their condition than as free people is so mind-boggling to us. But you found that this was the mindset in so much of the South.
Very, very much so. I mean, one of the beauties of coming into a story like this, of not as a Civil War scholar, with knowing relatively little about it, apart from some of the works that many of us have read, like The Killer Angels, that kind of thing. One of the beauties of coming in sort of as an ingenue is things that maybe somebody else would take for granted because they knew too much about it already. Mm-hmm. Came to me with a vividness that was absolutely startling. I mean, for example, you mentioned James Henry Hammond. Hammond was a U.S. senator, congressman first, and then a U.S. senator, and also the governor of South Carolina at one point, who was a prominent owner of enslaved souls. He owned, I believe, 600 enslaved blacks. He was a prime evangelist of what was called the pro-slavery movement, which was very, very important in the 19th century, the antebellum period. This was a movement where Southerners managed to convince themselves. It was never meant to convince the North that slavery was okay. The Southerners knew that the North was never going to accept that. But this was to convince themselves how good slavery was, that slavery was the best of all possible worlds for slaves. I mean, what could be better? A roof over their heads, 3 squares a day, insulated from the environmental exigencies of the economic, ups and downs of America. In contrast to the wage slaves of the North, where if you got sick, you were out, you were poor on the streets. And for these people, this was very, very compelling argument. Okay, forget the fact that Senator James Henry Hammond had a manual, printed a manual for his overseers on his plantations. He had 3 plantations. The last section of which was detailed instructions for how to whip your enslaved blacks. And to me, this is like, okay, I know that happened. We all know that happened. But to see this in such a matter-of-fact way, in a handbook for how to manage your slaves was incredible to me. Similarly, when I finally got to go to Charleston and to the Charleston Historical Society, I was going through the bank records of the Bank of Charleston, just because why not? And well, sometimes that's how I find some of the most interesting things that I find interesting, is if you open up document set and there's no rational reason why you would want to look in that document set, but you do it anyway, and you realize, oh my God, in this thing there were mortgages secured by the bodies of enslaved blacks, and it underscored the fact that it was not just about free labor for these people. Enslaved blacks were capital. They formed the capital structure of the South, and that was really important to know.
It just really, for me, was it's something to read fiction, and I have read a large amount of fiction when it comes to, especially African-American writers who talk about the horrors of slavery, and that sinks in, but when you see it that detailed in history, it is like, ripping off a Band-Aid. But it is, you talk about the details that you look for.
One footnote.
Yeah.
I deal in footnotes. Yeah. One footnote is that James Henry Hammond, one confession that he makes in his diary. This is an amazing diary, by the way. One confession he makes in his diary, that at one point he had a sexual dalliance with 4 of his nieces at once.
Yeah.
I know. What about the ick factor there?
Right. But that wasn't a part of the book when I read it. I had to stop and say, what? It's definitely a showstopper type of explanation of who this man was. But you talk about the diaries. Can you do this without diaries? Can you write these books without diaries?
Well, would I try to write a book like this about the start of the Civil War without diaries? No.
Yeah, right.
No. But if you're asking me, what are people going to do 20 years from now when they don't have diaries?
I guess we're going to look back on TikTok and be like, oh.
My feeling is that's their problem. No, but seriously, they may not have the diaries that I had access to for this. I mean, one of my second villain, Edmund Ruffin, a Virginian, who was an absolute hater from the get-go, hated Yankees to the core. He left a 4,000-page diary, which I read. And was about to hang myself, but
But you read it.
It's a 4,000-page diary, very detailed and actually incredibly accurate. He was a real jerk, but he was willing to confess that jerkdom in detail, right. And that to me was fascinating. In the future, okay, nobody's going to. Well, I don't want to say nobody. There may be compulsive diary keepers as we speak who are keeping chronicles of this era. But I also we have to acknowledge that there may be other resources that people will have, historians will have, that I don't have, but I would have loved to have. I mean, for example, when I wrote a book about the sinking of the Lusitania, wouldn't it have been a very different story if everybody on the Lusitania had an iPhone?
Right.
You know, taking videos, uploading them to the cloud, you know. I would have had too much information. I'm being a little bit facetious there, except for one thing that, you know, like the National Archives is archiving vast amounts of tweets. And these are things that, when you think about it, one of the things I look for when I'm working on a book is something that provides a real sense of immediacy. And typically, because of the areas that I work in, the telegrams. Telegrams are wonderful things. Well, okay, so you know, fast forward, we have tweets. How often? Often that's the first indication that something's happening. Yes. You know, and that could be a very nice. I can see how that could easily work into a nonfiction narrative about something. I can see a single tweet being a single chapter in a book about something.
Of course. So, well, it is truly the way that people are not only relaying information, but sometimes when they are being their most honest. When they will write something, and sometimes they will regret writing it. And we've seen that many, many times, but it lives on.
I don't know. A lot of the tweets I get, nobody regrets.
So I want to talk about Abraham Lincoln a little bit. He is obviously one of our republic's greatest heroes. But before the war, and I'm reading this because I want to make sure that I quote this correctly, that he did not encourage racial equality or intermarriage. In fact, in the book it reads that he wanted to protect slavery where it existed, but did expose expansion of slavery. So does the complexity of Lincoln make him any less of a great man?
No, definitely not. I mean, Lincoln in the antebellum period and in the first, let's say, 6 months to a year of his administration was, I don't think there are many Lincoln scholars who would disagree that he was in over his head. Yeah. But, you know, the beauty of Lincoln is, I'll tell you how I approached Lincoln. I was sufficiently arrogant that I was like, okay, show me that you need to be in this book. Tell me how you're gonna get me to put you in this book, because I really hate hagiography. I don't like heroes. I'm very contrary. If somebody tells me somebody was a hero, I want to see their tax forms, you know, that kind. I should be doing what you do.
That's, you know? Right. That would be great. I'll take somebody's tax forms. If he ever wants to pass it on to me, then I'll take those.
I really came to love Lincoln, and that's not always the case with lead characters in my books. More often than not, I come to dislike them. Again, that's sort of a personal trait that I'm actually working on with therapy. But things that made me come to really love Lincoln was, first of all, his intellect. I don't think there was a sentence that I came across that he had actually written in his speeches, in his letters, and so forth, that was not wholly original, a distinct cadence and structure that was very clearly Lincoln-esque. And I like that. It's a mark of a real sharp intellect. Yeah. I also loved his sense of humor. He loved to laugh at his own jokes. And by the way, he had a high, reedy laugh, interestingly. And it's sort of a reedy, high voice, too, by the way. What I also endeared me to him, two things. One, he couldn't spell. He could not spell inauguration. Because now, if we took a poll, I bet you a bunch of us couldn't spell it anyway. But he could not spell inauguration. He couldn't spell Fort Sumter. There's no P in Sumter. Right. You know.
You really can't fault him on that one.
No, I mean, I was really into it. But especially the thing, I think probably my single most favorite fact in the entire book, except for the ending, the single most favorite fact in the book is the fact that Lincoln and Mary Todd, his wife, before his departure from Springfield to Washington for his inauguration, had a yard sale.
Yes.
They had a yard sale, and they sold a bunch of stuff. There's a receipt in the complete works of Abraham Lincoln in the Library of Congress. Google it; it's great reading. All those papers, it's just tremendous. But here's this receipt for a yard sale, and I love those things because. You know, one of the things I like to do is also, I don't do it necessarily deliberately, but it invariably is one product of doing the books the way I like to do them, is that you realize that the way we are today, there's a lot of parallels and echoes in the past. A yard sale, of all things, and to pay for his trip.
Right. You know, he had to get there somehow.
Yeah.
But I do want to talk about that in a moment. But it was interesting that you talked about Mary Todd Lincoln and that she was really someone that encouraged him into this political life. He makes a joke about it at one point.
Yeah, she was very, very, very ambitious, although, are you talking about the joke in the freight car?
Well, that's what I was thinking, yes, yes.
Well, yeah, this was a funny little moment. There's a journalist, young journalist, Henry Villard, a German-born who was covering Lincoln. They turned up together at this remote train station in I think it was in Illinois. No building nearby, just as a giant thunderstorm approaches. And they both wind up dodging into a freight car and having a conversation together. And Lincoln tells a story about how bizarre it would be if he ever became president. Can you imagine a sucker like me being president? So
I always thought that would make an incredible stage play of Lincoln with a reporter trapped in the rain in this freight car. It's, you know.
That's not a bad idea.
It's not a bad idea. Put that in the back of your mind. Intention of writing these books, I think, is important because you aren't bound as a historian. You don't list an order of events of history. That's not what you do. And you aren't a journalist, so you aren't listing facts as you have found them.
But I was a journalist.
But you were a journalist, and that's why we like you. You're a writer, and your books, as we talked about before, to me, read like suspense novels. So I wonder how you juggle that, knowing that you want to write a great story that is going to keep your readers enraptured, but you are bound by the truth of history. How do you do it?
I don't see any particular challenge or contradiction there. For me, it starts with the idea. Okay. You know, not every idea lends itself to something that I would like to write. You know, I have several criteria when I test an idea, and I subject all my ideas to this criteria, series of criteria. One is that the idea, in and of itself, has to have narrative energy. Has to have narrative energy. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Otherwise, I'm just not that interested in doing it. Now, obviously, this is perfect for that kind of thing. But I have to be interested. You know, I have to, obviously, if I'm going to live with this thing for 4 years, you know, I've often told writing students of mine that you know, that looking for an idea is like looking for a spouse. You know, you gotta kiss a lot of frogs before you find one frog that kisses back in a not creepy way. Do you know what I mean? And then once you find that, then very, very important is there a deep enough reservoir of material, of fine-grained, historical, real-life material to allow me to tell the story the way I want to? And by that I mean letters, telegrams, memoirs, little bits and pieces that turn up in rich archives. It's one reason I cannot do things that I would love to do. I mean, I'd love to do a book about Magellan, you know, but I just don't have the stuff.
Just don't have the stuff.
Just don't have the stuff. I mean, I felt like I was at risk of tapping out my reservoir of material by taking on the Civil War, by going back to 1860 and actually prior to 1852, you know, Uncle Tom's Cabin and, you know, John Brown, whatever. But because of the nature of the Civil War, because of the nature of this antebellum period, there is so much material that I can go back much earlier than my comfort zone.
But is the intention, is it purely selfish to where you are like, this is really interesting to me, this is going to make a great narrative? Or do you take a lofty approach of this is something that people need to know?
The former.
Okay. Selfish.
Seriously, I approach it as, my goal in what I do is to produce historical experience, as rich and deep an experience as I possibly can. As I mentioned, the idea being that someone will sink into one of my books and maybe not want to emerge until it's done, and maybe suspend their knowledge of what's happening. Now, in the course of that, though, I know that what's the old saying? You can gain a lot more whatever with sugar versus whatever.
Yep.
It's
honey and fly.
That was articulate, wasn't it?
It's flies and honey, but we got you. We're good.
But the point is that my feeling is that if I tell a story richly and deeply enough, the historical significance, the meaning, will come through.
Yeah.
I think it's dangerous to try to make a point. And that's where you get into trouble, because then you start twisting things to make them fit your thesis.
Right. Yep.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Well, as I told you before this, many of us found you from A Devil in the White City, which, if there was a time to applaud, it's now.
Okay.
So I don't think and I told you this before, that I've ever had...
Could you, by the way, all send an email or a text en masse to Leo DiCaprio and just tell him, could you please make this film?
This is it, man. We got to get this. Let's start this campaign, everybody. I never read a work of nonfiction that I just couldn't put down, and that was Devil in a White City to me. And then you wrote, of course, Splendid in the Vile, and I wondered how you go about deciding what you're going to tackle next. I know you said that, but do you jot down ideas? Do you see something and say, okay, that might be something, and it's in your phone, and you say, okay, what's next? Let me look and see. Like, where does it come from?
I keep first of all, I wish I knew. I wish I had a 3D printer that would, cough out ideas left and right. I keep an idea journal. Anything that occurs to me, whether it's even for works of fiction, I've done one, and I'm working on another in my off time. But I write down these things in my idea journal, and typically it's just a one sentence, maybe it's a couple of paragraphs, and the next thing you know, maybe there's more piling up in that journal about that particular idea, and some ideas, though, typically serendipity plays a big role in things for me. Case in point was a book of mine called Thunderstruck, which is about Marconi and the weird intersection of his career with that of England's second most famous murderer, Hawley Harvey Crippen. And what happened there was, I was driving along in Seattle, where I used to live in Manhattan now, driving along in Seattle in one of my favorite parts of the city, the Montlake Cut, and some guy cut me off. He cut me off, he was on his cell phone. I was really pissed. And then I was just driving along, and I saw a cell phone tower over the Texaco station where we always bought our Christmas trees. And so I saw the cell phone tower, and I thought, wait a minute, maybe there's something in wireless, right? Maybe there's a story in wireless. So I went back into my office, I fired up my computer, Googled wireless. Right away, the website for the current iteration of the Marconi company popped up. I read through that, and interestingly, it has a timeline. So I went through this timeline, and here in this timeline, otherwise incredibly boring timeline, is a reference to this killer, Hawley Harvey Crippen. And suddenly I had this flashback, no joke, to when I would have been probably about 13, when my mother, who had a very dark sense of humor and loved writing mysteries and so forth, and was very interested in crime, told me the story of Hawley Harvey Crippen. I remember it vividly. I remember where I was in the kitchen. Suddenly this came back to me in my office. I thought, wow, maybe there's something there. Why on earth is this murderer in this timeline? So I looked into it and got more and more fascinated, and that's how that became that book.
Wow.
I owe it to that guy on the cell phone.
How about it? So we've been talking a little bit about research, and I cannot imagine the kind that you have to do and how much you have to do. But we talked about diaries. But at some point in the book, you even described the weather. And I wonder how you go about, you just talked about having to go through boring timelines. How do you decide what to include and just what to throw out? Because you know that you do want to keep the reader's attention and their interest. How do you decide what's so important to keep that's so specific, like the weather?
I don't know.
Or does your editor say, this is boring, it's got to go?
No, well, it all cuts to, seriously, I don't really think about it. It all cuts again to this wanting to create this historical experience. True, real-life historical experience. And to me, you know, one of the most important things in my daily life, I mean, to me, is weather. You know, I mean, I'm a weather junkie. I'm always checking my iPhone to see what the weather is, you know, in here or where my kids are and so forth. And when you think about it, you know, what's the first thing that you experience when you leave your house in the morning? You experience the weather. You don't necessarily acknowledge that this is a major influence on your life, but I like to think that by managing to capture a sense of the weather, that it connects people who know what that kind of weather is like to that moment in the past.
Sure, absolutely. So,
and historical weather is surprisingly easy to come by because of these diarists.
yeah, right. You know, that we've talked about this, you've referenced this, that the book is closely reflecting our current politicized political climate. So what do you think are the lessons from the Demon of Unrest that we need to take with us in the environment we are in now?
All right, so the two takeaways for me, and again, this is, I did not write this book to make a point about contemporary America. Like I said, I was at work on this thing for 10 months before the events of January 6th. But one of my takeaways from the book, from the research on the start of the Civil War, is that you know, when people start talking crazy, take them seriously. And the inconceivable is always conceivable to somebody. Mm-hmm. And so those to me now are sort of cardinal rules that I really think about. I think about all the time. I think about when I read the newspapers about the current situation. You know, I think about a certain individual wanting to have, you know, generals like Hitler had, and I think, what? Take them seriously.
And I think that is something that you take from this book as you think this couldn't have happened. These people couldn't have felt this way about slavery. It's inconceivable, and then it happens, and that's where we're at. Everybody be thinking about any questions that you would like to ask in a couple minutes here. We're going to open up the floor to you all, so I wanted to let you all do that.
I just want to jump in with something you just said there. One of the really interesting things that, to me, in the course of the research for this book, you know, as America, as this conflict, this national conflict was worsening, as we were approaching civil war, we know it as readers. The strange thing is, in that era, in the South in particular, no one thought it would lead to war. The common expression was, if there's any violent conflict, it will yield only enough blood to fill a lady's thimble. Then another guy, a senator, James Chestnut, Mary Boykin Chestnut's husband, Mary Boykin Chestnut being the premier diarist of the era, female diarist, wonderful, wonderful person. He actually volunteered to eat every corpse that was yielded from this conflict because he was so confident that nobody would die. Nobody believed that there would be this conflict.
And the mindset of the people of South Carolina was like, we're just going to do our thing, and
Yeah.
you all do your thing at the beginning, and we're going to be fine. It's no big deal.
You leave us alone. We just, and they, the best part is when they actually sent a trio of commissioners to Washington to negotiate for the purchase of Fort Sumter. Mm-hmm. And the war secretary was like, you know, we no sooner do that than sell you the capital. I mean, you know, what is this about?
That's right. Now, I will say, to correct something I misspoke, I said the people of South Carolina at that time. There were heroes in that, including, I believe it was a judge who was the one who said the famous line about, I was so glad you included that, and I wish I'd written it down on my notes.
And I wish I could remember the
yes,
famous line.
but it was to where it was talking just about how the fallacy of this ultimately is what it's going to be.
Are you talking about Judge McGrath?
I am.
Yeah,
yes.
I wish I could
so when you
remember
read the
quote.
book, you'll read that and you'll know what we're talking about.
It's a good quote, but I don't remember it.
Yeah, that is. It's a great quote. Couldn't tell you what it
Yeah,
said
but
right
that's
now.
a very good qualifier. It's not the people of South Carolina.
Right.
In fact, the main sort of fuel were these agitators who really wanted to have the state secede, the so-called fire eaters who just really were blind to the point where, you know, they couldn't see beyond the idea that they needed to secede from the Union.
Right.
So,
Well, and if you think we've had some lousy presidents in our modern era, spend some time with Buchanan. And that'll really make you feel like, okay, it could get worse.
Well, actually,
Maybe not worse, but in terms of spineless, it seems like to me at the end that's how history judges him.
Well, he's the second worst president in history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
he would, but Buchanan.
You're gonna.
Buchanan is a very interesting character in the book. By the time his administration was nearing its end, and as the national conflict was worsening, just ever deepening crisis, he didn't want to have anything to do with it. What he wanted was to go back to his country estate outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and just live out the rest of his days in peace. That's all he wanted. He did not want a war to break out on his time, and did everything he could to not prevent that war from happening, but basically to ignore the situation. He even told Congress at one point in his penultimate speech to Congress, he basically gave up. Yeah. He said, I can't solve this problem. It's not up to me. There's nothing I can do. This is the President of the United States, as the nation is about to start a war that kills 750,000 people. So he says, there's nothing I can do. He says, it's up to Congress to solve this problem.
Peace out, mic drop, he's out. I want to talk about titles, because you got some great ones, the titles of the book. And I know, having been in publishing myself and had a couple books out there, it's very much of a back and forth.
The Dark Above is very nice.
What's that?
The Dark Above.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Title for his upcoming novel.
But The Demon of Unrest, where did that come from? Why did that stand out to you? And to you, what does that mean?
So The Demon of Unrest comes from a letter that one of the relatively minor protagonists in the book writes about this demon of unrest that has been unleashed in the land. And he's sort of perplexed why this is happening. How did this come to pass? And he uses that phrase, the demon of unrest. And to me, it just resonated instantly, this idea of this demon racing around among people, stirring up trouble. Probably you could put Putin in that job right now. The demon of unrest just sowing dissent everywhere. And so I love that phrase. And I got zero pushback from my editors.
Well, surely with Devil in a White City, they were like, ka-ching, let's go.
No.
Oh, no.
Can I tell you
Did they want like World Fair Killer, and that would be what it would be?
Almost.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I tell you how that title came about?
Yeah.
So how that book came about, but I won't tell you the whole story of the book. But I had been meaning to do a book about a real life murder, and I couldn't find an interesting murder. I'd gone to the library, took out a book called The Encyclopedia of Murder. That's the sausage being made. I don't know where I came across the killer and the Devil in White City, whether it was H for Holmes, M for Mudgett, but I read about him and the acid vest dissection tables and stuff. Wasn't interested. I didn't want to write crime porn. I wanted to do something along the lines of, I don't know how many of you remember that film Gosford Park, something like that.
Something elegant, an elegant murder.
And so I kept looking for a murder. I got sidetracked by a book about a hurricane, came back to thinking about a murder. Nothing was happening, but I remembered that in reading the Encyclopedia of Murder, there was a reference to this World's Fair of 1893, which I knew nothing about, but it sounded like a big deal. I had nothing on my plate. Went to my library. I was living in Seattle at the time, Suzzallo Library, University of Washington, yay. Great library. And they had, much to my surprise, like a dozen books about the World's Fair of 1893, which is testimony to the reach of that fair.
Sure.
The first book that I read should have killed Devil in the White City right then. Should have killed it. Should have killed the idea right then. It was a monograph about one particular pavilion at the World's Fair of 1893. The most boring book I believe I have ever, seriously, the most boring book I believe I've ever read in my life, and I have read a lot of boring books in the course of my research. But I always know, check the footnotes first before you throw a book into the fire. Actually, I would never, ever burn a book, by the way. So I checked the footnotes. And the first footnote I come to that is of any interest is the fact that Juicy Fruit Gum is introduced to Americans at the World's Fair of 1893. Juicy Fruit Gum. That's my favorite gum. And I'm sitting there, that gum is 100 years old, you know? And then I started reading through the rest of the footnotes, came across Cracker Jack was introduced at the World's Fair of 1893, all the people who came to the fair, you know, all this stuff. Yeah. And I suddenly realized, I had this little epiphany, like, yeah, that's what this is. You know, I wouldn't want to have written about Holmes alone, but, you know, it was a bigger story than that. It was a story of darkness and light, you know? And I mean, the World's Fair was literally nicknamed the White City, and within 24 hours, I had my title, The Devil in the White City. I got some pushback on that, but I held my ground.
I want to ask a little bit about you personally. What would a teenage Erik Larson think about the man that's sitting on the stage today? Would he be surprised at how he turned out?
Oh, man, that's a great question. What would 16-year-old me think of me?
Yeah. Did 16-year-old Erik Larson even know what Erik Larson was going to do? Did you always want to be a writer? I mean, you were a journalist, but I didn't know if that was the ambition or what.
Well, I always wanted to be a writer. I mean, I would like to think that 16-year-old me, if he could fast forward to now, would be like, hey, all right, man, you did okay, because as a father, man, no.
Yeah, right,
So,
right.
But no, I was a good father to my kids.
Yeah.
But when I was a kid, I grew up in a household where the rule was, and we didn't have a lot of money, but the rule was if you wanted the book, you got that book. You just asked my father, asked my mother, you got that book.
Yep.
And as a kid, I loved reading. My big thing was the Nancy Drew books. You know, forget the Hardy Boys, forget Tom Swift. Nancy, I had the biggest crush on her. Actually, the biggest crush I had was actually on her car. Remember, she had a convertible? And so I actually wrote a very derivative novella when I was like 13. 75 pages, very derivative of a Nancy Drew book. I think I even had something like The Secret Clock in the title.
Wow.
Although, you got to do something distinctive, so I had a sex scene. And I didn't know anything about sex, so I would love to go back and find that.
You wrote fan fiction, is what you did. That's exactly what you wrote.
I did.
Before we open up the floor, I do think that we don't want to focus just solely on the direness of this time, the direness of the time that you write about. That there are always men and women that rise to their greatest abilities. And so I wonder, writing about and researching about Lincoln and Churchill, what have you learned about leadership? What do these men and these women of these times tell us about the leadership that we needed then and now?
Well, I think the clearest lessons in leadership came through Churchill, honestly. I really sort of wound up, not during the writing of the book, it wasn't a book about leadership, but afterwards, interestingly, because of the pandemic, people came to the book for solace. And, you know, this is a book about mass murder and carnage, but they came to it because this guy, Churchill, had a way of making people feel better about the situation that they were in. And so after the fact, after the book was out, and as I was doing a zillion Zoom things, you know, I started really trying to think about the leadership aspect. And a big part of it is, at the time, which is unfortunately gone now, was that speeches mattered. Speeches mattered. People took them seriously, and they were willing to listen to a speech for a much longer time than now, unless, of course, you're at a Trump rally where you sit there for 90 minutes. But typical speech now is more like 20 minutes, you know. But these speeches that Churchill gave, they were in the midst of the darkest time in the history of Britain, modern Britain, where there's a very clear structure in each speech. He would start out with a very clear assessment, very realistic, very stark, sometimes too stark for people. You know, sometimes his audience, you know, reported there was this bureau that tracked public opinion. They reported to this bureau that they felt ill after his speech. But he would start out with a very candid appraisal of what was happening. But then he would give equal time to why one should not lose hope, because there's no point in losing hope. And what was good about Britain, what was good about what was happening on the British side of things. Like in one particular speech, he said, people forget that we have a navy, and so he did that. And then, having done this realism, reason for optimism, he has that soaring closure, soaring ending to his speeches, which, as one of his colleagues said, had the very interesting aspect of making even the average Briton feel like he was part of the great story of Britain through history, and would move forward against this German threat in the same way.
Right.
Very stirring, very, very powerful.
Yeah. All right, everybody, this is your time.
And you can ask me absolutely anything except one thing.
Except for his opinion.
And I'm not going to tell you what it is.
So I will look for a show of hands, and then I'll repeat the question if we can't hear. So we'll start with this young lady right here in the glasses. Please do. Just so to get everybody in the back here. If not, okay.
I'll repeat the question.
Yep.
How do I choose my characters, right? That's it. How do I choose my characters? And then how do I know when I've got enough characters?
When to stop, I think.
When to stop?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So two different things. So first, how do I choose my characters? This is going to sound awfully glib and trite, but that's who I am. The characters choose me. When I'm doing my research, I very impressionistic research, and if I come across somebody who has a lot to say and a lot of material in which to say it, that person's going to be in my book. I mean, like in the Demon of Unrest, Mary Boykin Chestnut, the diarist I mentioned before, is very contemporary voice, and at one point she refers to one of her fellow socialites as a miscreant. She's in the book. People declare themselves to me like, what if I write about Senator James Henry Hammond? Am I doing this just because out of a prurient sense that this guy is really off the charts and how interesting, or is it because really he in a way he embodies so much about the antebellum period? One problem with writing about the Civil War is that it is the start of the Civil War. There's so much backstory. But if you tell all the backstory in sort of, monographic way just to get it done, nobody's going to read past it, right? But if you have a character like Senator James Henry Hammond, who embodies the backstory, each phase of things, who reacts to Uncle Tom's Cabin, who reacts to John Brown's seizure of the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, which, by the way, was huge. I never understood the power of that on the American psyche, but my God, that's what came through to me also. When do I know when to stop? Obviously, from this answer to the question, I don't. But there is a. I think of my narratives as a Christmas tree, right? That's the spine. Once I've got my Christmas tree, I get to hang all the ornaments on it, like the Lincoln yard sale and all this stuff get hung on this tree. And then, eventually you get to the point where there are too many ornaments on that tree, and it becomes very obvious to you that this tree is going to fall over or something. But it's not so obvious to me as the writer. So then I give the book to my wife, who knows she is the best detector of crap that you will. Those of you who liked The Devil in the White City, you may have liked it much better if I had been able to keep the 25 pages that I had in there about the construction of the auditorium building in Chicago. On the other hand, you might not.
Is she responsible for making that cut?
She made that cut, no matter how hard I argued to keep it in. But she really is my secret weapon, and she really helps me see. Very important thing. The way she does this is she does symbols in the margins. And the symbols include an up arrow. I know that's good, keep it. Down arrow, getting out. Smiley face, very important, because after you've been working on a book for 4 years, you forget the things that made you smile or made you cry. You forget the emotion. And so then she comes along and reminds me, oh, that's, yeah, because she'll have a smiley face, a little teary face with tears coming down. Yeah, so she has those. And then the worst, of course, are these long lines of receding Z's. It's true. It's true. So she's really valuable. But I'm a big believer in putting everything in the book, right, and then paring it out. Don't self-edit along the way.
Trimming the fat.
Yeah, but I also will say that by the time I start out, I have a pretty good idea of what my ending is going to be. My book proposals typically include a capsule outline of the entire book, which helps me capture the narrative and the narrative power, but it also has a pretty precise sense of how it's going to end.
I think that's important. I'm glad you do that. I know someone, this young lady right here.
But anyway, she just said she's a historian. We tend to be boring. Okay. What advice would I give to a historian who's trying not to be a boring historian and a boring writer of history? Don't be boring. Go with your instincts. Let yourself go with not just, okay, this is. See, there's a difference between having to earn tenure and writing the story that you really want to write. Somebody who has to earn tenure has to do boring history because there's no way around it, you know? But if your goal is not to do tenured history, if your goal is to write, let yourself think about what's going to bring this story to life and what you like when you read things. I mean, what do you do in your free time? Do you read fiction or nonfiction? What? Mostly nonfiction. Oh, okay. All right. You're a Holocaust historian.
Important job.
So, are you reading diaries for your work or for? Oh, okay.
Okay, so you're in school. Yeah.
Yeah, thesis is worse than tenure. Yeah, but how good that you're doing Holocaust work. I think that's got to be really compelling.
Yeah.
So,
Kudos.
but I go with your instincts as to what you would want to read.
Yeah, I think that's we write the books we would want to read.
That's what
right?
I do. Yeah,
in fiction and nonfiction. Let's see, lady there in the glasses. Hi.
So, how do you write?
I am an incredibly slow reader. Incredibly painfully slow. It's not a particular disability. I don't really understand it, but I am so slow. I think I'm just constantly processing sentences and so forth, and I don't know. I'm very slow, and that incidentally is why I typically don't blurb other people's books, because it is my personal policy that if I'm going to blurb a book, I have to read that book all the way through, and it would take me a month. So. It's not that bad, but it's bad. What was the first part of your question?
It was about the reading, the amount of reading and writing you do a week.
So my day is really bifurcated. When I'm writing, I get up very early. This is a thing that started when we had toddlers, and it was a self-preservation thing. I get up like 4 or 5 o'clock, work until breakfast on the writing. And my daily goal when I'm writing, I think it is a tremendous mistake to binge write, to like write all day, because then you're burned out. And the toughest part about writing is starting again the next day. So I write for about 3 hours. I try to get, my goal is 300 words, but typically I end up with 600 to 700 words. I don't go back and edit it each day. I just accumulate this as I go. And I always end in the middle of something, at a point where I know I can pick this up the next day right away. And the beauty of that is that, I will stop in the middle of a sentence. The beauty of that is that, like I said, the toughest part about writing is getting up the next day and doing it again. Beauty of that is you wake up the next day, you finish that sentence, you're instantly productive. But because you went to bed that night, with an incomplete sentence, it's like the human mind is like the IRS. It hates incomplete things. And this sentence will be wandering through your head all night long, and suddenly we'll latch onto other things. And suddenly, you wake up the next morning, I get myself a cup of coffee, I get my double stuffed Oreo cookie, 1F and double stuff. I get my double stuffed Oreo and my cup of coffee, and not only do I finish that first sentence, I get like 4 or 5 paragraphs rolling, and once you're rolling, you're good. The key thing is stop. Know when to stop. So that's my week. But I have to add to that the reading I do during the day is the hardcore research reading. I pride myself on being able to read anything, no matter how boring, because you never know what the little telling detail is going to come from the single most boring thing in the world. But my wife and I now have this ritual. At 5 o'clock sharp, I ring this little shop bell, those little chrome bells, bing, and I turn on Spotify French Cafe Lounge music, and we have a drink.
And that's it.
And then I read fiction for the rest of the night.
That's a great life right there. Young lady here in the front with glasses.
All right.
All right.
So I went to Columbia Graduate School. Good. Wow, what a nicely phrased question.
Yes, he is.
Yeah, I like the flavors. It's just part of that whole hard nightmare of coming up with ideas. Coming up with ideas is the single hardest thing that I do, and making an idea, distilling an idea to that kernel that can then blossom to become other things I can't really formulate it. It's something that I've learned how to do over time. But there was a very interesting exercise when I worked for the Wall Street Journal, writing feature stories. We were taught once. A great journal writer came through once, and he talked about what the Wall Street Journal was big on nut graphs. Nut graphs. Nut graphs was a paragraph 3 down in a story that basically explained why you should be reading this story. There was a little formula. I'm not going to remember this quite as perfectly as it was related to us, but the idea is, I am writing about this, and you should read it. You will be interested in reading this because this, and suddenly it helps you really isolate. Yeah, that's what this is. Anyway, I'm not articulating this as well as the question was articulated.
I don't want to ignore the back. Does anybody in the back row have a question? Yes, sir.
I'm an elder millennial. I grew up in a world where communication was instantaneous, always.
Wait, you're what?
I'm an elder millennial.
I love the elder millennial. Yes. So
That's a little dark humor there. That's pretty dark.
one of I really am sorry. I am Scandinavian, but I'm not that dark. The communications thing was very interesting to me in this research. We think about the telegraph as being the next best thing to instantaneous, iPhone communication, whatever. And the telegraph was a miraculous thing back in the day with the advent of the telegraph. This was an amazing thing that you could get a message instantaneously from hundreds of miles away. But one problem with the telegraph was that it was leaky. That is, it had to go through various nodes. So if you're sending something top secret, you didn't do it by telegraph because, some telegraph operator is going to say, "Hey, everybody," So there were these moments where something very important was happening, and there was no way to communicate it in real time. Tried by mail. Mail took, initially maybe 3 days, and then it took, 6 to 7 days. letters would cross, miscommunications left and right. It was really a fascinating thing. Now, I was being facetious when I said maybe we'll find out, but one of my concerns about contemporary situations, wars and so forth, is, of course, the ultimate fear is miscommunication leading to nuclear war. And that's something we have not worked out yet. Oh, there I go again.
Yeah.
But anyway, so communication was very important in this book, really fascinating to me.
All right, we got time for about one or two more questions right here.
Wait, is there anybody else up there? Because
I don't. Okay, you're right.
It's hard for us to see in the light.
It is. So we're going to get to you, and then I see you all in the back, so we'll get to you too. So why don't we start here? As long as you guys are good on time, we're good. So go ahead. I do keep the research.
How do I keep track of all the research notes and stuff for my books? Come to my office. I'm actually very old school. I print out all my materials, print out all my documents. I process them all, then I outline the documents. So I end up with big stacks of documents, themed by whatever, and coded. So that, one document might be, Lincoln dash Roman numeral run dash 232A. And I know that a particular quote is at that location. And then, before I actually start to write, I go through everything and I make a chronology. Chronology being, to me, the single most powerful tool in storytelling. I make a chronology, and every fact that I've collected that has any kind of clear time stamp goes in the chronology, coded. I don't have the whole quote in there, but I coded with enough of the quotes so that I will remember. And that is the key thing that helps me find stuff. This chronology will be 185 single-space pages, but it's very accurate. It will tell me exactly where that quote is. And one rule of thumb is, which I adhere to very strictly, is that if you can't find it, you can't use it. Which really bummed me out with the Churchill book, because there was a statement that his personal secretary made about the Queen's corgis. And he said, in an unguarded moment, he said, "Those stupid corgis." But I couldn't find it again in my notes, so it's not in the book.
Wow. That's the good journalist in you, too. Yes, right up here. Hi.
Oh, good question. Which book was the most fun to research? The most fun to research, well, Splendid and Vile was actually a lot of fun to research, but the one that was most fun to research for various reasons that have nothing to do with research was when I was working on my book Thunderstruck about Marconi and the English killer, because I got to travel to Italy and travel all over the place. And I'll close with, can we close? Should we close? I'll close with this story. So, have all this stuff lined up in Italy for research for this book, and I'm going to bring my eldest daughter along. At this point, she was 16. She has the gift. At this point, she was already fluent in Italian. So I was going to bring her with me to open doors. So we're about to set out, and the Pope dies. Pope dies. His funeral is going to be the day after we arrive. The word is that all reservations in Rome are going to be canceled. We're going to have to sleep on the plane. I'm thinking, oh, Jesus. No relation to the Pope, anyway, we set out. Turned out all my fears were naught. Rome was just alive in a way I've never seen before. Traffic was banned from the old city for the inner city, except for cabs. We go to our hotel. I promise you there's a payoff here. We go to our hotel, and I tell my daughter, look, talk to the concierge and try and figure out a good place for dinner while I check in. So she did, and she swears that in fact the concierge knew a little bit about what was about to happen, but we didn't know that at the time. So we go to this restaurant in the old city in Rome, a restaurant called Da Sabatino. It's a relatively cool night, but hey, when in Rome, we're sitting out on the outside part of the restaurant. There's also an interior part. We're the only people in the outside part of this restaurant except for 4 priests who are drinking comped whiskey. So we said we're getting ready to pay the bill. And the waiter, who was absolutely charmed by my daughter, comes over and he says, you might want to order dessert. That's like, okay, what's going on? We ordered tiramisu, what else, Sure enough, 5 minutes later, this caravan of Italian police cars, these low-slung, gray Italian police cars, come screaming into the piazza with these totally incredibly handsome young cops, literally leaning out the windows with their guns drawn, right? This caravan comes into the piazza in front of the restaurant. At the center of this caravan of cars is a giant black Chevy Suburban. Got to ask yourself, how the hell did that Suburban get into the old city in Rome? Was it dropped in by a Hercules helicopter or what? So, but there's this black Chevy Suburban. Doors open, and a shockwave of charisma blows through this piazza in Rome. Who steps out of this big black Chevy Suburban but William Jefferson Clinton? Bubba himself steps out of this Chevy Suburban. And by the way, I should point out that at this point, my daughter was just totally enthralled with the TV show Alias, everything having to do with spies and international relations. So here comes Bill Clinton out of this thing, comes walking up the center of this outdoor part of the restaurant. He's coming up to us. Who's he looking at? Me? No. He comes up opposite my daughter. He goes, well, hi. And she looks up at him and goes, hi. And on he goes into the restaurant, and that was the high point of my research career.
Erik Larson, everybody. Erik Larson. What a pleasure. What a pleasure. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you.